right. So I would first like to thank everyone for joining us today. Hopefully everyone's staying warm and staying safe. For those who are on campus and have that commute home, definitely make sure that you're careful out there, as I believe it should be getting a little worse from what I've seen on the news. So just be careful. So understanding bias. Again, thank you all for being here. And I am Dr. Anthony Jones, Chief Diversity Officer here at Slippery Rock University. So have to bear with me as I'm working through the haven't presented virtually in a while kinks, which I'm excited about because we've been in person. So just giving an overview of the objectives. And I also wanted to let you know that we are recording as well. So if that's something you're not comfortable with, please feel free to exit the room. I will let you know that we will post this on our website, but we will edit it to the point where if anyone shared anything that you don't want out there, anything personal, we will not post those things. So just be mindful of that. Because we are creating a safe space where we can talk and be comfortable, as I'll go over the ground rules shortly. But we want to make sure that you know that nothing will be shared that is out of bounds. So just be mindful of that as we go through this space. So objectives: to increase participants' awareness of the concepts of unconscious bias, which we'll be unpacking that in a lot of different ways as we go through this. Assist to recognize bias within themselves. So a lot of this, especially on the front end, we'll be talking about self-exploration, where our biases come from, where they're rooted, things along those lines. And then to enable listeners, or learners rather, to recognize the impact of their personal bias on others. And we'll be shifting into talking about what that looks like in like the hiring process and individuals we work with and so forth. All right, so before I start any type of trainings, cultural competency, anything along those lines, always start with ground rules again, in order to try to create a space where we're comfortable, where we feel safe, where we can share, where we can learn and grow from each other. All right. So first things first is active listening, which we are doing now at this point. And if we can keep this up for like the next hour, that would be great. And I usually ask individuals to turn their cameras on. Completely up to you if you choose to or not, but let you know, I can only see like 3 dots, 3 squares anyway. So if you don't have it on, I wouldn't even know. So completely up to you if you choose to or not, but it just helps in that virtual space to feel more in person. Speaking from your own experiences, so throughout this process, I will be asking you to share things that you've gone through, things that you've experienced. Again, you are all experts in the space of your own bias. So I want that expertise brought to the table as much as we can, so we can learn and grow from those experiences. Don't be afraid to disagree, but do so respectfully. And as we're sharing, I'm just being mindful that someone may share a different view from you, different perspective. Trying to create a space where that is okay, where we can disagree, and that's just fine. And just making sure we're being respectful in that space as we do so. Participate by choice. I can't say it could be a fairly boring presentation if I end up being the only one speaking. But again, completely up to you. We're trying to create a safe space. So if you don't feel comfortable sharing, that's perfect. But if you do feel comfortable sharing when that time comes, you're definitely more than welcome to do so. Don't invade other stories. So as individuals are sharing their perspectives, their experiences, let's not try to make it a one-up type of thing where you experienced something way worse and back and forth. That's not the space that we're looking to create. Just looking to create a space where we, again, are safe, we can share. And again, that participation is completely up to you to do so. The goal is not to agree, but to gain a deeper understanding. This goes back to disagreeing, but doing so respectfully. We definitely want to gain a deeper understanding from our own experiences. And again, that's how we learn. That's how we better work with each other. That's how we get better perspectives. So, and I always resort back to challenge by choice. Last but not least, be conscious of body language. This is a huge one, as we can see you in many cases. And body language can be just as disrespectful as actual language. So if someone is being vulnerable, someone sharing in this space, we want to avoid those deep sighs, those eye rolls, things along those lines, as someone may be truly just trying to learn and sharing something that may be near and dear to them. So let's be mindful as we work through this. All right. So we are all on the same page. Can I get a thumbs up or perfect? All right. So moving along. So pretty much a glance of what we'll go through today. So we'll start with some exploration, which I talked about. Then we'll open the mic up, and that's when we'll kind of go into our breakout rooms, talk a little bit from there. Some mental models rather. Then we'll break out and we'll break through and really talk through unconscious bias, what it is, what it looks like, so forth. We'll talk about some of those implications in the workplace and what some of those bias look like in the workplace. We'll have a moment of clarity, and then we'll wrap up. And can't see a clock right now. Well, I'll just keep time on my watch. So perfect. All right. So when I talked about the self-exploration, this is where we're going to start. So if you have something to write with, you can write either in your phone, on a piece of paper, notepad, whatever that you have close. I'm going to ask you to write down how you identify in these 5 categories. So completely understanding when we talk about how we identify, there's much more than 5 categories that make up how we identify. But for the sake of this activity, we're going to focus on these 5 spaces. So race and ethnicity, gender identity. I'm sorry, I'm getting thrown as the people are coming in. Gender identity, religious affiliation, sexual orientation, and age. As I look through this, race and ethnicity, Black African American, gender identity, male, religious affiliation, Christian Baptist, sexual orientation, heterosexual, age is where I choose to participate by choice. All right, so I'll give you all a few seconds with that, and then we will come back to the table. Oh, so I can't blow this up the way I want. I think I can. Yes. All right, so I can see most folks. So we'll give you a few more seconds as I still see heads going down, which I assume that means writing. All right, perfect. So if you're still writing yours out, just feel free to do so as we start to work through this. So perfect. So as you wrote down your 5 identities, I would assume as we talk about these categories, these are the identities that you identify with, right? So what I'm going to ask you now, out of those 5 identities, for the one that you feel is most important to who you are as a person, to the one that is least important to who you are as a person, I'm going to ask you to remove the 2 that are least important, and then share out with the group what 2 you removed and why you removed those 2. So this is the part where we participate by choice. So if anyone wants to click in and share, that would be terrific.
I can share.
Thank you for breaking the ice. Perfect.
Okay. So the 2 that I excluded were my age.
Okay.
And also my race.
All right. And why'd you, you got it. Why'd you remove those 2?
Because age is just a number. And I think how you feel and how you navigate through the world matters more than your age. And for my race, my race has a lot of baggage with it. As a white person, I recognize the harms that the white race has done to many other people. So I don't really identify that much with my race.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Could we have one more that would share the 2 that they removed and why? Yes, you have it.
Me? I'll share.
Yes, I would point, but it's not going to help at all. Yes.
I removed the religious and the sexual orientation.
Okay. You walk us through that?
I removed the religious because I don't know that I identify as anything really now. I used to be Catholic, but now I don't know that I'm anything.
Okay.
I don't know that I'm atheist either. I really don't know where I am there.
Mm-hmm.
And sexual orientation, I just removed it because I don't know, it wasn't that important. And it's not something that I think about a lot for myself.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I understand the comment, the last share about race, because I'm white as well, and talking about the baggage and all. But I feel like I've thought about that quite a bit. I feel like that, to me, that puts it, I feel that baggage too. Mm-hmm. And the 2 white sons that I produced, and I feel that baggage as well, but that's one reason it stays on my mind. For that reason it stays on my mind. So I think you said like the ones that aren't as important to you personally. So I left it on there for kind of the same reason.
Got it. All right. So you're going to be challenged as we move forward then. All right, so continuing along with this theme, and thank you for those who did share. You should now have 3 of those 5 identities remaining. I'm now going to ask you to remove 2 more of those identities, leaving you with, out of those 5, remember, understanding there's more that make up who we are, out of those 5, leaving 1 identity you feel like is most important to who you are. And then I'm going to ask 2 more people to share what identity that was and why that was the number 1 for them.
I can go.
Have the floor.
So I put for race and ethnicity, Caucasian, Ashkenazi Jewish, and a European mutt. I think that that is the biggest part of my identity, which is why I got rid of the last 4. And
Can I ask you what were the last 2 you had before you got to race and ethnicity?
Yeah, so I had religion and gender identity were still there. I just got rid of those 2.
Got it.
And I also learned in a conference in Europe that they don't like the word white, that they use the word Caucasian a lot because it's more encompassing than just the color of the skin. So I try to use the word Caucasian rather than white whenever I can.
Thank you for sharing. Can we have one more?
Can I just make a quick jump here?
Yes.
Okay, well, I know I feel like I'm pulling us backward, but I need to share here a little bit of my perspective on the first question when you ask us to basically provide answers to these 5 categories. So to me, I find all 5s are important. Now, if you were to ask me to remove a couple, I would say perhaps the one that I would feel more prone to remove would be age, right? Someone said age is just a number. So I could do away with that one more easily than the other one because I find all other 4 are really related in such intricate ways. It makes it so difficult for me to really think of one that I could easily remove and find still I can define myself, if that really answers the question.
It does. It gives a different perspective. And I'll just move along here because I don't want to waste too much time in this space. But that is so when we talk about the 5 identities and the one that you were able to narrow down to be like, this is the one out of these 5. And I do think they are all very important to who we are. But for the sake of the activity, to choose that one, how does that reflect now how you see other people? So when you talk about how difficult it may be to just choose one, I would assume that your bias lens is probably different to other individuals because you have a hard time not seeing them in their entirety. But some individuals, I'm sure, if we would have worked through this, we would have saw that some people didn't have as much difficult time just choosing one identity to say, this is the identity that if I had to choose one, this is the one that this is who I am. So now when we think about that from the perspective or from the lens of being biased, we naturally tend to favor things, individuals who are more like ourselves. So when we talk about that self-reflection piece, we do have to be mindful of how we view ourselves, how we see ourselves, and then how we project that out onto other people. And I will always be transparent in this space. And I will say as a Black man, which would have been race and ethnicity would have been my race would have been my number 1. There is a self-check that I have to do whenever I am interacting with different races and someone who is Black is in that space, to be mindful that I'm not being showing favoritism towards that individual, and I'm doing my best to be as equal, and of course we keep equality in perspective, but being as equal across that group as I can, right? So keep that perspective as we move forward, because we'll continue to refer back to this identity wheel. All right, so I want to do this activity with you all really quick, and I have to shrink my screen back down so I can see. Oh, jumping the gun there. All right, so I'm going to just ask you to follow along with this. I will ask if you have seen it before that you don't give it away, so other individuals can have an opportunity. But I'm just going to ask you to follow along and see if you can get the question right. All right. And I'll ask, everyone can hear that? Okay, perfect. I'm going to start it over.
I can't hear it. Did you press share volume when you shared screen?
It's necessary, but not very. It just kind of helps drive that point home.
I think
'Cause it's not,
your image is fine. Just ask the question.
just ask the question. I'm not sure what you're saying.
Yeah, read the question on the screen.
Oh, but you have to see the video to get the question though.
We see the video, we just can't hear.
Perfect. All right. So the question is, how many passes does a team in white make? All right. I didn't realize the audio wasn't there. All right. So we'll just watch through and answer the question once it finishes up. Got it. So again, apologies on the lack of volume, but I asked the question again. How many passes did the team in white make?
Was it 12?
We got 12.
13.
We got 13. Anyone say 11? 12, 13. Perfect, perfect. So then I asked this question, but did anyone see the dancing bear?
Yes.
We got some that did.
I
got
did,
some-
but I saw it
No,
before.
I did not.
All right, so I'm gonna just play this back. So you know that I'm not making something up or switching videos on you. And then I'll ask you to just watch from the lens of watching the entire video and opposed to just watching to try to count the passes. This is an awareness test. Gotcha. So, and the answer is 13 for those who wanted to know. So now as we think about this from the perspective of our bias functions much like the team in white making those passes. But because of the experiences that we've had, the things that we've gone through, the conversations and so forth, we're really not able to see that dancing bear right in front of our faces. So it's not like there's something that we do on purpose. Oftentimes, it's not something that you mean to do, and that's mean to be offensive in the process of doing. It is something that we oftentimes do unconsciously. And it's because of the things that we stored over time that now helps us make shortcuts to get answers to questions that we may have to answer quickly. Or oftentimes we just miss things. So then I want you to think about this in the perspective of not just working with your colleagues, but also how that looks when you're working with students. When the student comes into your classroom, and I won't ask anyone to share this, but just some self-reflection, how quickly do we judge that student based off of a student that we've seen that may look like them, an interaction we may have had, something we may have saw on television, and so forth. And these are the things that we carry with us in our interactions. And are we holding an individual back from being successful because the person we see in them may not or has not been successful in the past? So now you have this idea that you placed onto this person or onto this student that may hold them back from the space that they may have earned to be. And we'll talk about this, how it looks from a faculty staff hiring process as well. I will say, Keisha, if you could work on this so I can keep going, if we can get the volume to work, because there are several other videos that I want to show that we would need the volume for. All right, so we will move along. So this is a quote that I wanted us to have so we can kind of build off of this as well. So we simply assume that we see things in the way that they are or the way they should be. And I think that is something that a lot of people carry, and I'll say I carry for sure when we talk about our bias. And our attitudes and behaviors grow out of those assumptions. And this is from the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. So I just want you all to take a second and talk about that. What do you think about this quote? What comes to mind when you see this quote in reference to bias that you may have or just in general?
I want to say this is I definitely share the idea that that is there's some truth in this, because in general, also the person we are is where we come from, our surroundings, our perspectives are not something that we build overnight. It's something that we grow with. And so to some point, in some ways, I think it also requires that we question certain things that we believe are true, because oftentimes these are actually not really proven to be true, but it's just because of the circumstances and the environment we grow up in that really influences us in very strong ways.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Anyone else? What are your thoughts on this quote?
To life with a different cultural lens and different lived experiences. And it's really important to know that my lived experience isn't your lived experience, and that
Absolutely.
we're going to have altering views of something based on our lens and those views that we come with.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Keisha, any luck on the value, or Amber?
It's actually gonna have to come from your computer. You need
Gotcha.
to hit share volume.
I am not seeing that option. Where's that at?
Share
You have
screen.
to unshare and reshare.
Great, you're gonna have to stop, exactly, stop sharing your screen.
Gotcha.
Click the share screen option, I believe. It should have that arrow, should be able to give you more access, and then you need to hit share volume.
In response to the question, just one more comment. If
Thank you.
folks who are dealing with privilege, unless we've done the work on examining our biases, then we are consistently taking those biases and working them to advantage.
Got it. Thank you for sharing it. Also, thank you for helping me work through the sharing process. All right, get us back on track. All right, so again, thank you all for sharing where you did. So now I want to transition a little bit and give us an opportunity to continue our reflection and talk amongst ourselves. So another quote that will help lead us through this. So to reach others, we have to first know ourselves, which I think is a huge part when you talk about bias and really addressing the biases that you have. You really have to be honest and be able to have some self-reflection. And to contact the deeper truth of who we are, we must engage in some activity or practice that questions what we assume to be true about ourselves. So when we talk about that practice, I want to take a second to explore some of our experiences with some of these diverse descriptors that I'm going to share. So I think for the sake of time, we'll scratch the breakout rooms and we'll just share as a group. Again, safe space and participate by choice. So I'm going to ask you to share what message did you receive growing up about the following descriptors? And the first is age. So if you think back to your first interaction, your first conversation, or just that thing that you keep with you as the perception of age, what is that? Where did that come from? And anyone can unmute and share.
Well, I was always taught that you respect your elders.
Absolutely. I was taught the same thing. Anyone else?
For me, that was my experience growing up, respecting my elders. And as a child, I was sometimes informed that it's important to know when to speak up and when to be quiet. And especially in the company of adults, be respectful of your adults.
Yep, children stay in the child's place. I was definitely raised on those principles. Absolutely. So just even thinking from those two perspectives, when we talk about respecting our elders, but then also as someone who's younger, that person needs to stay in their place, right? And that speaks towards the power of age and maybe the lack of power of youth. And not putting this perspective on everyone, just for those who shared, and I also share that upbringing, those lessons as well. So then how do we check ourselves when we're in the classroom having a conversation with a student? And then how do we really check ourselves if we are having conversation with a younger professional? Understanding we are both in this professional space, but you may have seniority over that individual, or that individual may have seniority over you, but you are expected to both do your job equally. And how does that power dynamic play into that space, right? So we won't continue to unpack that too much because we have a lot that I want to try to work through in the next 30 minutes. But just something to think about when you talk about that power dynamic. So now let's talk about social economic status. What were you taught growing up about socioeconomic status?
I can address this because my father and mother were both poorer growing up than they were as adults. And so there was a definite bias against people of lesser means. You know, we would never buy something from the thrift store, and that was shameful to do, and that kind of thing. And so, yeah, it was interesting.
Absolutely. Anyone else?
I think money was often equated with success. So wealth or having a high paying job somehow inherently meant that happiness or success came with it.
Mm-hmm. And that even reflects like the two-way street of bias, because now if you see someone who appears to be wealthy, someone who appears to have status, we now, I guess, do we now treat that individual differently? Because of how we think they should be treated based off of what we think they have or what is perceived that they have, and then the vice versa of that. Yes, I see a hand.
Well, it's very interesting for me because I was always taught, and I too grew up in a very poor family, but I was always taught that you don't judge people by what they have, but by who they are. So I think it's interesting.
Absolutely. And I was definitely raised on what you have kind of is your worth. So I remember being like completely broke, but my family would still try to purchase things that made it appear that we weren't, because of how people would treat us. And that bias definitely reflects in that way. So moving to our next one, sexual orientation. So what were you taught growing up about sexual orientation? What message did you receive?
I can speak to that. I grew up Catholic. So in church, it was condemned. But within my family, they never really spoke poorly of people of different sexual orientations until later. So it's kind of an interesting story there. So I'll leave it at that.
Absolutely. I thank you for sharing that. Anyone else? That first message or the message you remember about sexual orientation?
What I remember from growing up, so when I was quite young, is zero. There was never any mention, nothing, no acknowledgement, just no discussion, like non-topic, never knew a conversation existed.
Wow, that's perspective. Thank you for sharing. Moving along to religion. What message did you receive about religion? Yes.
I can speak as somebody in a marginalized religion. I had people tell me that I didn't look Jewish, the look of a Jewish person, that I didn't act Jewish. I was supposed to be acting a certain way to be Jewish and that sort of thing. And so even though I was in a community that had quite a few Jewish members, even as a young person, I had a fellow student tell me, well, you know, the Jews killed Jesus, you know, and, you know, had to deal with a lot of situations that weren't so pleasant. So
definitely. Thank you for sharing that. Because even in that, and you sharing how much bias is in that you don't look Jewish, like, what does that even mean? But now you see that person has an idea of what a Jewish person should look like or what a Jewish person should act like. And where did that come from? And that is their bias and those experiences over life that they're now taking from themselves and placing on you, which oftentimes we do. So thank you for sharing that. So race and ethnicity. What messages did you receive growing up about race and ethnicity?
I grew up in South Florida, and we just were taught that we love everyone. And, you know, my neighborhood was very diverse. We had lots of ethnicities, races, we had lots of religions. And so for me growing up, it was very different than like the students I'm around here. So it's always very interesting to see like the perspectives on race and ethnicity in a different area in the United States.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. Anyone else?
I was gonna say, I kind of grew up in the opposite situation, pretty much in a Little Italy type suburb of the Pittsburgh area. So everyone was of Italian descent and Catholic. My school was 100% Caucasian, but all of my grandparents were immigrants, and so not all of them were from Italy. And so I grew up with not like, if someone asked what I was, it was never like just white or like, yes, I'm Italian, but I'm Hungarian and Macedonian. And there was a lot of stress on the importance of where you came from and keeping some of that culture and not just keeping what was kind of the popular culture. And so that side of it, but also my parents did, I think, a very good job at trying to recognize that even, I mean, you had my grandma from Transylvania, my grandfather was from Italy, even their skin tones were very different. So they did a good job at saying, yes, you haven't had a lot of exposure to this, but they, you know, African Americans are no different than Italians in the fact that your color of your skin or how dark you get in the sun doesn't determine your worth.
Mm-hmm. That's powerful. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing those. We'll skip through these last ones and just think on this question, or that last one, and just think on this question now. So your past experiences impact your relationships or how you interact with coworkers, students, etc. And really, and Jen, I see your hand up. We'll just take a second to reflect on that one and move on, because I got a ton of presentation, because I never know if people are going to talk or not. So this is great that we actually are. But really just something to think about. Do those experiences impact your relationships? And can you honestly answer those questions? And can you honestly kind of call yourself out if you're allowing those experiences to impact your relationships in a negative way? And it's really something that we have to think on in all of the spaces that we interact in, especially in our roles in relation to campus. All right. So consciously uncovering unconscious bias. So I think it is important that we first off define this, because we've just been kind of looking internally. So now as we talk externally, what does bias even mean? Anyone want to jump in and take a shot at that? What is bias? What is it? There's no wrong answers in this room. What is bias?
I will say it's preconceived notions we have of other people, regardless of like their culture or their religion or how they look, because of different things that we've heard or seen growing up.
Absolutely. And that is a definition that is for surely correct, but just more of a formal definition of it. So when we talk about bias and the prejudice and things along those lines, where do those come from? Like, where do we get these bias from? Yes, you can just jump in and answer.
No, I can't. I have ADHD. I'm terrible at interrupting. One thing I'm just going to bring up about my own background is everything was much more subtle than what people are describing, as in, you know, an anti-Black bias was there, but it was subtextual, if that makes sense. And so I've really had to, I'm losing track of what your question was even. That's also ADHD.
I'm just speaking about where bias come from.
Right. So it comes from every interaction you have, and also
Absolutely.
from what your social your social environment tells you over time.
Absolutely.
So you can be developing these biases your whole life and not even realize it, because nobody comes out and explicitly says, well, we don't think Black people are the same as white people. They just act like it, if that makes sense.
It
So
does.
like in my school district, there were kids that were bussed in, and they all hung out together, and we all hung out together, and there was no real attempt to integrate us in a meaningful way. And so they were always the other, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And thank you for sharing that. So we talk about bias and where they come from. They truly come from everywhere. Those experiences growing up, that time you read a newspaper, social media, television, that time the person may have taken the soldier out of your hand and put the doll in it. Pink is for girls, blue is for, like, we hear all of these things and we collect them. And sometimes we are well aware of those bias, but oftentimes we are very unaware that we have those bias. So hopefully our sound is working. But we've reflected on our internal perspective of bias. We talked about it externally of where they come from, what they mean. So we're going to watch this video and see, even after all of that, if our bias still comes into play. All right. So let me know if you can hear this. Hopefully you can.
What do you want?
Mrs. Edwards, I know I ask you this like every week, but.
All right, and for the sake of time, we're going to stop there. But being mindful, we are in a safe space. And again, we talk through our bias, where they come from, what they mean. So as we watch this video, and we can just do a raise a hand in our screens, how many people thought it was the Black guy playing the music? And I would have to raise my hand as well. We can usually unpack why we thought what we thought, but I'm sure we'll have a variety of perspectives on why we thought that, but really having a conversation with yourself on why you thought that. Oftentimes it's because the person was in the car, it's because he was dancing to the music, and as we continue to peel those layers back, and I can say for myself, it's because it was a Black guy in a what appeared to be a Cadillac without music playing. Like, these are all of my experiences as I connect dots that leads me to believe it was the Black individual playing that music. I will also think from the other side that an older, what appeared to be white woman wouldn't be listening to music like that. But those are my experiences that I'm taking internally, and I am projecting out into the scenario to get answers before I actually know the answer to that question. So can we check ourselves if we find ourselves doing this in a classroom, doing this with a colleague, doing this in life? And oftentimes you do need people around you to be able to shoulder tap you and say, hey, you know, what you assumed may not have been correct for various reasons, but we also have to be open to receiving that as well. So just something to think about, but wanted to put that in a visual so we can take that with us. I'm going to start pushing through a little bit as we try to save some time here. So what is unconscious bias? So we talked about bias. Now we're going to get into it. So what is unconscious bias? What does that mean? What does it mean to be biased unconsciously? I thought we were on a roll there. Anyone want to take a
I
shot?
think the example you just shared, it kind of reminds me of unconscious bias. Like, I assumed that it was the Black guy playing the music, and I think unconsciously thought, oh, well, an older woman wouldn't be playing that music, but didn't realize it until you said it. So there was kind of two biased thoughts going on there.
Absolutely, and we will take that and run with it. So here's some more of like formal definitions, but I like to put unconscious bias in this perspective. So oftentimes people will say unconscious bias doesn't exist, and I think that's a fair perspective. I would say it's something I disagree with, but I can understand how someone can say that. But every day we breathe in and out unconsciously. We don't have to think to take a breath. You just do it. Every second of the day, we're breathing in and out unconsciously. But now if I said take a deep breath, you would have to consciously think to inhale and then exhale. And I like to say that is the difference between when we are biased and we are unconsciously biased, right? So with those definitions there, and this is more so bringing that perspective home, unconscious bias are stereotypes about certain groups of people that individuals form unconsciously. Again, this is from a collection of ideas that we've stored over time. Unconscious bias happens outside of our control, which oftentimes isn't something, I think guilt comes along with those things, but isn't something to necessarily feel bad about. But they do exist, and it occurs automatically and is triggered by our brain making quick judgment. So oftentimes we make those mistakes as we are trying to move quickly.
Anthony, just a quick
Yes.
question. Do you consider unconscious bias and implicit bias to be the same?
I don't, and I usually get into implicit right after this, but implicit is more so when the action takes place. So now that bias is allowing you to actually act towards someone. I have examples of that. I don't have that example in here, but they do differ. They do differ. And I would show that video, but we're going to skip through it because we are crunched on time right now. So, so this is just more of a breakdown of unconscious bias. what it looks like, what it means. And I can share this out if individuals want to read these in more detail. I did want to show this video because as we talk about unconscious bias, making those quick decisions, this is an example of what that looks like. And we can unpack this after we watch.
Michaela is a 7th grader at a majority white middle school. Her responses completely change depending on the race of the children in the picture.
Marcy and Renee are in school together and they're in the hallway, and I'd like you to tell me what you think is happening in this picture.
She probably looks like she's gonna steal it because Marcia's like, oh no, what happened? And he's like, hey, look, $20.
And so, do you think that Renee is doing something good, bad, or just neutral?
I think she's gonna take the money.
Do you think that Renee and Marcy are likely to be friends or not?
Not really.
And what do you think about Marcy's parents? Do you think they'd be comfortable with her being friends with Renee or not?
Well, if they find out the situation that happened, they might be a little concerned about if Renee's a thief.
In this one we have Erica and Allison, and they're also in the hallway at school. Can you tell me what it seems is happening in this picture?
Allison looks like a sweet girl, so I think that she would pick up Erica's money and give it back to her.
Okay, so then do you think Allison's doing something good, bad, or neutral?
Pretty good.
And what about Allison and Erica? Do you think they're probably friends or not so much?
Yeah, they're probably friends.
Okay. Do you think Erica's parents would like it if she was friends with Allison?
Yeah.
Her responses, according to our expert, Dr. Melanie Killen, could indicate a subconscious racial bias, a bias that kids develop from messages they hear at school, at home, the characters in the TV shows they watch, and what they see online. And Michaela's reversing the scenarios based on race wasn't unique. 24%, almost a quarter of all children, both white and African American, saw their own race more positively than the other race. And this happened across all ages and all school types, no matter the racial demographics.
What do you think happened in this picture?
The girl pushed her.
And what do you think is going to happen next?
Brandon's going to help her with her books.
So do you think that Randy's doing something that's okay, not okay, or kind of in the middle?
Not okay.
Not okay? Is Andre doing something good, bad, or just okay?
Good.
Michaela's answers were very...
All right, so we will pause there. Let's unpack this a little bit. What do we see? What are we thinking?
I have young kids. For those that don't know me, I have 2 7-year-olds and a 5-year-old, and I think about this kind of stuff all the time. We do live in a predominantly white town and white school district, and I think about what my kids are being exposed to or not being exposed to. And I think I'm lucky that I have Ziprak and I can bring them up here, and there's a little more diversity and people that look different. But I think it's really interesting of a study, and I wonder what my own kids would do. And they'd probably react similarly because they don't have a lot of people that look different than them in their everyday life at school.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Thank you. Anyone we haven't heard from want to share what they're thinking, what they're feeling?
I would just like to share when I was in 4th grade, I grew up in a predominantly white community, and a Black family moved into our town. The father was military and was stationed at the base next to our town. And so the son, his name was Curtis, he was part of our class, and we had to do square dancing. There was a play and there was square dancing we had to do in the play, and no one would dance with him because he was Black. And so I was really disturbed by that. And so I went home and I asked my parents, is it okay if I dance with Curtis? And they're like, yeah, absolutely, dance with them. And it really took me back. And here I was in 4th grade and I saw that happen, and I was like, and I knew something was wrong, that was happening. So yeah, it's just astounding to me when you look at these videos that, this is happening, and what can we do within our households, to educate young children, about these biases and how wrong they are.
Yeah, and what's most interesting, this is, the video shows, but this stretched across age ranges. So you had small children to what appeared to be early high school, late middle school. And they had it, if we watch more of the video, it goes into conversation with the parents who we are not teaching our child to say these type of things or to be this way. But oftentimes those lessons do come outside of the household, where you're picking up these different things from maybe friends at school, magazines, social media. Again, these influences just come from all over the place, and they come out as we interact. One thing I thought that was interesting, what Aubrey said with our last video, she said, I didn't realize that until you pointed it out about the woman being older and not listening to that type of music, and did this play into me thinking it was the Black guy. So when you look at this, I really wish like we can just talk to the students, to those kids, and say, well, do you realize we just flipped the color of the person and you got a completely different answer? And I think it would click to be like, oh, I didn't realize that, because that unconscious thing kicked in. And we start with the identity wheel for this video in particular, because as you watch those videos and those scenes happen, each person favored the individual that looked like them. Because when we talk about our bias, oftentimes that is one of the major things that trickles in, is we tend to favor individuals who remind us of ourselves, our experiences that we've had, our pleasant people that we've met in our lives. And we tend to favor those individuals. So I'm going to jump back to the presentation so we can, again, try to get through at least majority of this. So when we talk about the conscious beliefs and unconscious, this is oftentimes what it looks like. When you think about the iceberg perspective, when you can see that little piece up top, but just so much that is underneath that we can't see as we're in the water, right? So that is oftentimes how it reflects on the conscious things that we know that we're doing, and those unconscious things that we are unaware of that we're doing, or how we're interacting or treating people. I would get into this activity to drive that point home, but we'll skip through that and talk more about what unconscious bias looks like and the different types. So we have that similar to me effect, which we talked about, leniency bias, and I'm going to push through these two. Halo effect, recall, first impression is a huge thing, confirmation bias, negative and positive skew, which I see happen all the time, judging women on potential, and I'm sorry, I can't see the whole thing, judging women on performance while judging men on potential, I think is huge, especially when we talk about work, and I'll push through so we can talk a little bit about what that looks like in the workspace, which that concept comes back up. Stereotyping, central tendency bias, all of those things are different types of bias that oftentimes shows itself in the work that we do. And I like this quote, so I decided to share it. At least half of the exercise I get every day comes from jumping to conclusions. So when we talk about those bias, again, we just have these ideas that we know are right because they have to be based off the experiences that I've had or I've gone through. And when you lay that on the table, everyone will have a different answer from that perspective. But oftentimes you have to push through and actually get to the facts and the truth of different matters to remove those bias from that space. We'll skip through this activity as well. We'll skip through this one as well too, because that will start a conversation. All right, so unconscious bias implications in the workplace. So impact of unconscious bias in the workplace. So this may put your institution at risk of a lawsuit, a toxic organizational culture due to perceived discrimination practices such as, so when we talk about the recruiting, interviewing, hiring decisions, how do we allow those bias to come into those processes, right? We talk about mentoring, job assignments, when we talk about training, how do we let those bias come into those spaces? Promotion, reviews, pay increases. I know for a fact, this is something that specifically at Slippery Rock we experience as I have these conversations, I would say on a daily basis, in one of these categories about how someone feels like they've been discriminated against or some bias is taking place and how decisions are being made, right? So we talk about the different types of bias that fall under these categories. So implicit bias in assessing candidates. So oftentimes we do come to the table with blind spots, and oftentimes when we refer to unconscious bias, people call them blind spots as in those things that you just can't see that you're doing. And that can lead to bias assessments, and that can be in a negative or positive way, which I talked about, that two-way street of bias. So sometimes that bias does allow you to put a person ahead as far as that assessment goes, where you're giving them higher remarks because they've said something you can relate to, or they said something that reminds you of you in some way. And then on the other side of that skew, when you talk about the negative part of it, where they're saying something that's completely foreign to who you are and what you've experienced. So you're like, well, this can't be the right person, right? So in those evaluations of candidates, you're not motivated to avoid those things or have the skills to do so, which these type of conversations help create and develop those skills to identify those bias or those blind spots that you may have. One thing that I often hear is people talk about a bad fit. I feel like that's like our code word to say like I don't like this person for a very specific reason, to just put that in the bad fit category. But I feel like bad fit is is just wrapped in bias in a lot of ways. Especially if you can't, which I've been in these type of conversations where you can't necessarily define what it is that bad fit is, or is it that you don't necessarily want to say what bad fit is, and it may be just the unconscious piece speaking as well. But just being mindful of how do we unpack that and where does it come from, and is it being fair and equal to the individuals that we are actually looking at and processing in the job process. And so getting into some more types of, so snap judgment, making judgments about a candidate without sufficient evidence. Again, that's the bias piece because we connect the dots in our mind. I got the front end of the story. I don't necessarily need the back because I've seen this story before and I know how it ends. And that's not fair to individuals that we may be working with and so forth. So keeping those things in mind as we are a part of those hiring decisions, as we are a part of those promotion decisions and so forth. Elitist behavior, it's also called raising the bar. So this is when increasing expectations for women and underrepresented minority candidates and being mindful of that. So raising that bar because their competency doesn't strike the committee member as trustworthy. So now it's like, well, why doesn't it? And that oftentimes is wrapped in experiences you may have had in your past that you are now projecting out into that space. So downgrading the qualifications of women and minorities rather, based on accent, which I've heard and seen this happen too many times, which are things we definitely try to address. The dress of a person, their demeanor, and we take all of these things and we create these stories. I've literally seen a person walk into a room, interview and walk out. And as we were evaluating the candidate, people had entire stories about who this person is, the type of person they are. And I'm just like, how did you get that based off of that this person may have had dreadlocks or this woman may be older? Like, how did you get this whole story based off of the questions that we asked that individual? So really trying to check those things. Cloning, this is something that I see all too often where we replicate ourselves in the hiring process, or we get to the point where when we're replacing someone, we are seeking to replace them with the same person. You'll often hear someone say, well, this candidate reminds me of insert person who's leaving or insert person who retired or has left. And we're trying to recreate that person. So it doesn't even allow us a fair opportunity to evaluate other individuals because we know who we're looking for because we're looking for the same person we had. Or we're looking for more of ourselves in that space. So are we really truly trying to diversify the individuals that we're hiring? Or are we just looking to hire more individuals who are just like us, look just like us, have the same interests and so forth? So we talk about that bias piece. Those are huge pieces of that. Where are we at? So some of the consequences of status quo, which is what you end up being in if you are not aware of the biases that you're bringing to the table. That can cost you time, money, and efficiency, which I've seen that happen several times as well. So being mindful of that, unhealthy tension between people of differing gender, race, ethnicity, age, abilities, and so forth, which you will see departments start to separate. You'll see issues in different spaces because of these type of consequences that come from just doing those status quo type of things, loss of productivity and increased conflict. Just being transparent in the space. I know a lot of individuals across campus who aren't happy in the space that they work in. And a lot of that comes from some of the biases that I believe is brought to the table and should not have been. And we are doing our best to rectify those different things, but it is important that we notice that in ourselves and we start to rectify them internally. And the inability to attract and retain talent because people see these things happening. And they oftentimes don't want to be a part of it. So they move on. So what service are we doing ourselves if we're not doing those self-correcting things in those spaces? So some things to consider. Who are we excluding or including and excluding? Who are we including and excluding as we talk about that bias in the workplace? So just again, some things to consider. Who are we encouraging and who are we praising? And then oftentimes, who are we promoting? Is it the same individuals? Is it the same category of individuals? And are we being mindful in what we're doing? Are we collecting data on what we're doing and what that looks like? And I could say those are things that we have in the works now. to really try to get a better lens of what we're doing and why we're doing it. Whose contributions are we likely to recognize? I think oftentimes we get caught giving praise to the same individuals as if individuals aren't working hard across campus collectively. But where does that come from? Is that person your friend? Does this person remind you of you? Like, where do those things come from? And really trying to get to the root of those biases. Whose mistakes are we likely to notice? Are you coming from a perspective of you look like this person who always did X, Y, and Z, so now you are more likely to see that in that person and miss it in someone else who may be even doing worse, because our bias come into play in that space? Is there anyone who contributes, is there anyone whose contribution we may sometimes overlook? And that goes back to the last comment. All right. So depending on where we were, I had a lot more because I didn't know if individuals would talk or not. So just trying to make sure that we had things to cover. So we'll skip that video. But in conclusion, learning about and accepting diversity and inclusion can improve your interpersonal effectiveness and increase your personal and professional opportunities while creating a sense of culture, belonging, and a natural part of institutional culture. So things to keep in mind. One thing that I want to do before we close is just have a moment of clarity. So I'll ask the audience to share one more time as we talk about one thing that we may have learned, one thing that we may have realized, one thing that we were pleased at. So I was pleased at X, Y, and Z, and then one thing that I was not aware of. So if I can have one person share one thing that they've learned. And that could be about yourself. That could be however that looked for you. I learned that.
I wasn't aware of the concept of the identity wheel, and I'd never really given it any thought before. So that was interesting, trying to slot myself into the different categories.
Yeah, that's great. And thank you for sharing that too. I'm glad you took an opportunity to really put that on yourself and see how that looked in your life. That's great. I realized that. Is there anything that someone realized?
I realized that some of the biases and actions that you were describing were experiences I had had, and I hadn't thought of them in that way before.
Definitely. Thank you for sharing that. I was pleased that.
I was pleased that I had a different perspective of the video with the gentleman in the car and the woman on the outside than most people did.
That's good stuff. Thank you for sharing that. And last but not least, I was not aware of that.
I was not aware of the concept of cloning, having gone to hiring and training and diversity components. I hadn't heard that word. So thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And thank you. So just some closing points. If you want to follow up at any point, have conversation, email, my contact information is there. I do want to apologize for rushing. I am really thankful that we had conversation in the way that we did, though. It's always hit and miss because I know being transparent in this space can be kind of touchy. So I try to make sure I over-prepare just in case no one talks. But this was great. I'm glad to see what we learned. I definitely learned from you all throughout this process. And I look forward to our next one, which will be on microaggressions on February 22nd. Same time, hopefully different place. Hopefully we'll be in person, which will be great. So thank you all for your time, the vulnerability, the openness, and the experience. And best of luck with the rest of the day. So, and travel home safe for those who are on campus.